Now, we've been looking at the ion, and we've got to the point again that Socrates is a little bit frustrated because, or at least trying to get further into this notion of what is going on with Ion and Ion's ability vis-a-vis that of Homer's poetry. And which seems that, once again, Ion's going to, try to imply that it's got something more than there's some sort of there's a randomness or whatever. And Socrates, once again, is trying to figure out what's going on with Ion's capability for understanding and interpreting Homer. In other words, so around 533e, right? Again, we're looking at what is this relationship R that Ion has to Homer. It doesn't seem to be knowledge, right? Again, it seems to be very odd to say that you could just know Homer, right? Homer's a poet, and so's Hesiod, and you only know Homer, and you don't know Hesiod. Isn't that kind of like only knowing, that dog as a veterinarian, and you don't know anything about that other dog, right? That seems very odd. And if it is the case that you have some particular relationship, as dear Ion, with Homer and not with Hesiod, then that relationship doesn't seem to be knowledge. And so I have a relationship, maybe with respect to my dog, and I like when I say I know that dog, or whatever. Maybe it's not really knowledge. It might be something different. Okay, so again, Socrates isn't a skeptic. He's not denying that Ion has something going on with respect to Homer, that there's some kind of relationship, and he's trying to figure out what it is, and it doesn't seem to fit into the notion of knowledge. And so he says, okay, look, I think what it is not knowledge, it's divine power. That's what I think's going on here, says Socrates to Ion. And of course, Ion, like, hey, that's not a bad one, that I'm divinely inspired. We've seen him be, okay, there's some, yeah, if you want to read it that way, that sounds pretty good. And who wouldn't, like it if you were pretty good at someone and at some area of study, and someone said, well, you're divinely inspired. That's kind of a nice compliment, I suppose. Okay, so then Socrates says, look, I'm going to make a little bit of an analogy here. And what is that? This divine power is kind of like magnetism. Now, of course, the ancient Greeks, they didn't know all the stuff we know about magnets and all that stuff, but they did have some notion, and the term magnetism or magnet comes from a term for the land where these stones that were found, sometimes called lodestones, that had these magnetic properties. And so the Greeks, played around with these things, and they had some idea about what magnets would do, but they really weren't sure what they were. But they exerted this kind of odd force, and not just on anything, right? As you know, a magnet can exert a force on certain kinds of objects like iron, but it's not going to work on, a magnet wouldn't work on wood. So, and the Greeks knew this, right? They were familiar with this stuff, and they thought it was a little curious, but it seems to fit. So the muse is to the poet as the magnetic stone is to the iron ring. So in that way, we have sort of the muse kind of attracts the poet, but doesn't attract the mathematician, for instance. And the magnetic stone can attract the iron ring, but doesn't attract a piece of wood. Okay, so you can unpack this in a variety of ways. But there is this kind of chain of thing, as that when a magnetic stone picks up an iron ring, it's as we would say now, it induces a magnetic field that will flow through the ring, and then the ring becomes magnetic itself, and you can pick up other rings. We've all done this when you have a magnet and paper clips, right? Pick up one paper clip, then you can stick another paper clip, and then when you pull the magnet off, the whole thing collapses. All right, so the same thing is going on in this, the magnetic stone muse analogy. So you have the muse here, then, like poet, the actual poet like Homer would here, the rhapsode is here, and then the audience is here. So they're all being, attracted or pulled, or there's some power coming down from the muse into humanity. So this idea also was very common with the Greeks. It was divine intervention of some sort. They believed in it. And of course, lots of religions today also believe in the notion of divine intervention. God works through mysterious ways, but some people say that there is interventions of God. So this is just basically that kind of an idea. And likewise, to complete the analogy, the magnetic stone is here, and you have these rings that are all magnetized. And then, so the rhapsode's kind of in the middle of it, kind of along with the poet in the middle. So up here is the muse, and down here is the audience. So you can think of it like that. So Ion, has enjoyed all this, that the poets represent, right? So the poet represents the muse or represents the god, and then the rhapsode represents the poet, right? Because remember, there were two sides way back at the beginning. That there's two sides to the techne, right? You're not sure what it is, but still, at the beginning of our dialogue, there's two sides to the techne, and one is, getting into the mind of the poet, and then the second part of the techne, which I haven't really discussed, was the most appropriate and beautiful way to represent what is in the mind of the poet, right? So the poet represents the muse, and the rhapsode represents the poet. So a rhapsode is a representative of a muse. Okay, so representatives of representatives. That's what you are, Socrates says to the rhapsode. And again, a great gig, because you're representing the divinely inspired Homer, and you too are kind of divinely inspired. So Ion has liked all this. Yeah, I'm divinely inspired. That's great. But he goes on and says, you're not in your right mind when you do this. When you are in the process of being divinely inspired, like this ring is very different when it's being pulled on by the stone. It has certain properties that it normally doesn't. So it's kind of a different object when it's magnetized, right? Than when it normally is. All of a sudden, this new property comes out that we would say was not in the stone, but was, put in that was not in the ring, but was put into the ring by the stone. We now know that physics doesn't quite work that way, but certainly to the Greeks, it would be like, wow, this thing is totally different now. It's doing something that it never did before. That had to come just from the stone. And so something is, inspired in the ring by the stone, just as something is inspired in the poet by the muse. Okay, so so Ion kind of likes this idea, but not surprisingly, he doesn't quite like the idea that that a rhapsode, is kind of out of his mind and it's totally irrational, right? Maybe it's not knowledge, maybe it's a power, but he doesn't like this idea that it's totally irrational, right? That he's crazed. And Ion says, look, if you watch me, I'm not crazed, right? That's not really the right way to go. So he doesn't quite like that. It seems that Ion, if we read, a little bit in between the lines here, it seems that Ion is saying something like, well, maybe it's not knowledge, but it's not totally irrational. Can there be a non-cognitive or a non-knowledge-based relationship that is still nonetheless rational, right? It's not just insane or crazy or whatever. So that's kind of what Ion wants to thread that needle, right? It's like, yeah, okay, it's not knowledge like the way a charioteer maybe has knowledge, but still, it's not crazy, or I'm not crazed when I do my job. It's wonderful and beautiful, and there's a beauty and there's a rationality to it all, even if it's not knowledge. So can you peel those two apart? Like, can you say that maybe that rationality isn't just limited to knowledge? Yeah, it's part of it. Knowledge is part of rationality, but rationality is broader than knowledge. Is that a possibility? So there's lots to think of in this wee little dialogue at the early start of Plato's career. So he says, if you watch me do my thing, you're not going to think I'm irrational. And around 537, Socrates says, okay, time for another look at you, right? It's all about you, Ion, so let's have another look at you. And let's look just at you and Homer. And Socrates, again, is going to start about kind of going down the knowledge pathway, and says this. Okay, look, Homer speaks about chariot driving. Homer speaks about tons of things, but let's just use this to think about Socrates' generalization. But his first instance, Homer speaks about chariot driving. Now, when Homer talks about that, and Homer does give advice, so there's quotations from Homer in this dialogue. So Homer gives has a scene where one person who is giving another person on how to drive and turn a chariot. Okay. Now, if you were to look at Homer on chariot driving, Socrates says, who's the best person to judge whether or not what Homer says about how to turn a chariot is a good way to turn a chariot, a bad way, a mediocre? Like, who's the best to make that judgment when Homer talks about chariot driving? Is it a rhapsode, or is it someone who actually drives a charioteer? Right? Who's better to make that judgment about what Homer says? So again, we're talking about reading, and evaluating Homer. Well, Ion goes, okay, yeah, it'd be a charioteer. Yeah, better than me. I'm not a chariot driver. So, yeah, okay. So when Homer talks about chariot driving, that's not really my thing. It would be a charioteer that's better. And so, yeah, because that's not my thing. That's not my profession. I'm not a chariot driver. I'm a rhapsode. So, okay, so then he's admitting then that Ion is, that, okay, he's not the best judge of Homer on chariot driving. Well, we're now, pardon the pun, we're off to the races, because Socrates is going to generalize this, right, and say, look, Ion, Homer speaks about all kinds of things: chariot driving, music playing, music making, relationships. We've seen this before, right? We've seen Socrates talk about how many different things that Homer has in his poetry. All these things, and in each case, he gets Ion to admit, oh, well, okay, when Homer talks about playing the flute, okay, a musician is a better judge of what Homer says about flute playing. Okay, when Homer talks about medicine, yeah, a doctor's a better judge than a rhapsode. And so so it's basically when Homer talks about this, yeah, it's somebody who's a specialist in this who's better than a rhapsode. And they keep going on and on and on, and right? And so eventually Socrates says, okay, once again, what you still tell me that you have this ability with Homer, right? You have this kind of relationship. I said it's sort of a divine power, but you still wanted to say, it's kind of knowledge, or it's at least rational. Once again, what is this thing that you're talking about? Now, if you go to the original Greek and try and chew your way through that, Ion at this section, when Socrates is basically saying, what does a rhapsode know? Ion in the original Greek, in this kind of, from what I can tell in the Greek, it's pretty washy what he says, right? And so you can look at different translations, but it's kind of he gives this very wishy-washy answer. Well, he says, as I see it, kind of in my view, or I imagine, all these translations are at least I think very, very plausible translations, because Ion's not really sure of what he really knows, right? And give him a break. He's been sort of hammered by Socrates for quite a while, and it's not looking good. He's got something, but it's not clear as to what it is. So he says, well, as I see it in my view, I imagine that a rhapsode would know what is fitting, whatever that really means, or what should be said. So by, let's say, a man or a woman, I mean, really broad, huge categories, like what would be said, what's fitting for a man to say, or a woman to say, or a slave to say, or a free man, or a leader to say. That's kind of what a rhapsode knows. Not so. Maybe the rhapsode is not really kind of like the specialist, with this, in our modern sense, like really the technical knowledge, the technician. No, which is, of course, that comes from the Greek term techne. Maybe what the techne that Ion has really isn't like all this stuff. Yeah, well, fine for them. What I really know is the big picture stuff, right? That's where my rationality and my knowledge is kind of on this big picture thing. What would a leader say that's appropriate? What would a man say or a woman say that's appropriate, etc., etc. So, not surprising, Socrates goes, okay, well, we'll try that now. Socrates is going to zero in on this one, mainly a leader, and he's going to say, okay, You say that you kind of know what a leader, what's fitting for a leader to say, what's fitting, or what should a leader say. Let's take a look at that now, says Socrates, and we'll look at what situations. We'll put a leader in very concrete situations, and then I'm going to ask you some questions about what a leader should say in those concrete situations. See you next video for that.